He clutched the edge of the table with fingers that had once broken men and markets, and the blood on his cuff glittered like a confession under the chandelier. "I've got 3 months left," Don Alessandro Moretti rasped, and the room, with its muted plates and the soft clink of Elena Rossi's fork, narrowed to that single impossible sentence. He laughed, not a cruel laugh, not the slow, victorious chuckle she remembered from televised raids and whispered threats, but a small, shocked sound, like a man who had been told his own obituary and found it strangely accurate. "Be my wife. Everything will be yours." Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elena's breath left her in a quiet exhale that felt like a negotiation. The private dining room of Palazzo Moretti had the sterile luxury of a bank vault. Beige silk walls, a long walnut table, a single bowl of citrus that no one touched. Outside, the city slivered with rain. Inside, 3 men watched her from differing distances. Alessandro collapsed against his chair like a ruin, Marco Vitale standing broad and wary near the doorway, and Johnny, the family's accountant and the most careful man she'd ever met, seated opposite with a ledger open like a liturgy. The staff hovered beyond the double doors, trained not to come in unless summoned. Power had its etiquette, cruelty had its timing. Elena felt both closing in. She straightened her napkin with hands that did not tremble. She had rehearsed refusals, indictments, strategic delays. She had spent 5 years in courtrooms bargaining for settlements, watching corporations buy their sins and calling it justice. None of that could have prepared her for this peculiar, naked offer, an ancient man offering matrimony like a contract, like a final lever to reserve his name in marble and mouths. "Why me?" she asked, and the question was both practical and personal, because beneath the public cruelty of Moretti's networks lay the private wreck of her childhood, the Moretti-led corporate sabotage that ruined her father's factory, the settlements that forced her family to move, the debt that lodged like a thorn in her mother's ribs. She had not expected empathy. She had expected a trap. Alessandra's eyes, once iron, had softened into something unreadable. "Because you will not be bought," he said, "and because you could fix what I've broken in ways my nephews never could. Because you're a rumor in my files and a problem in my conscience." He coughed, a wet animal sound. "And because I don't trust Marco to keep this house from burning the way he wants." Marco's jaw tightened until she could see tendon. He had the look of men who believe the world is their inheritance, thin-lipped, precise, with hands that had learned to close like traps. Elena watched him like a lit fuse. Marco had spent a decade inside the Moretti apparatus, learning the choreography of loyalty and brutality. He had also cultivated enemies and friends with knives. If Alessandro offered marriage as an instrument, Marco saw it as an insult, an affront to the natural order he had sculpted for himself. He stepped forward as if to strike, then paused at the table's edge. "This is theater," he said. "You'd marry a man who can barely stand because you think you could learn the ledger? Don't play games." Elena's smile was slow. Play was what she did best. "I don't marry for titles, Signor Vitale," she said. Her accent kept the steel from her syllables. "Nor for theater. I negotiate." She set her fork down with an economy that made Johnny look up. He was older than his ledger suggested, and had the look of a man who kept his head bowed until the moment it saved him. Federal agencies, Elena had learned in the long nights between pleading rooms and client calls, had interests in men like Gianni. Sometimes the sandwich between ledger and conscience contained a federal agent. She did not know which way Gianni would tilt, but she kept him in the corner of her plans all the same. When Alessandro steadied himself, pushing a hand to his chest as if bracing the ache within, Elena could see the crumbling map of him, a man who had controlled markets and ministers, who had invested in algorithmic sabotage and the quiet bribery of boards, who had ghost-written empires and erased their debts. He breathed slowly, like a man learning to keep rhythm with fewer beats. He kept his diagnosis a private dossier in the folds of his own mind. Only tonight, with rain and exhaustion and perhaps an odd streak of contrition, did he speak the truth aloud. 3 months, he repeated. Maybe less. The doctor said. He stopped as if insulted by wrapped formalities. It doesn't matter what they call it. It matters what I leave. I don't want Marco alone to inherit a burning house. I want someone who'll use the keys differently. Elena felt the ledger tick against the bones in her skull. Her brother's face, darker now in prison light, lines sharpened by indignity, rose between her ribs like a ghost. He had been framed, a cyber attack fabricated in a downtown law firm's server, a planted IP trail, and the signature of a Moretti encryption backdoor shed once seen in a late-night court deposition. The ledger, the back door, the names, all of it mattered. Her brother's sentence had been a paragraph in a pile of corporate legalese. His plea had been a short, wretched phone call that ended with the sound of the guard's keys.
"If I accept," she said, "and this was a bargaining table draped in intimacy, what guarantees do I have for my brother? What immunity, what legal weight will your name carry?" Alessandro's features, for a second, were ordinary, the map of his face smoothed into something like remorse. "I can do many things." A smile, quick and knowing, threaded through his voice. "Appointments, pardons, instructions to men who obey paper more than conscience. My name opens doors, sometimes even those of courts, if placed in the proper hands. More importantly," he reached for her hand, and the hand she extended felt like a test that might be a lifeline. "My signature is still a seal. I want to sign something that redeems what I've done, in the only way I know how. And I want someone beside me who will not only keep my secrets, but—" He stopped, and there was a small human panic in the break. "Who will tell me when secrets have to be burned." Elena's laugh was quiet. "That's not redemption, Don Moretti. Redemption is not inventory." She kept her voice level but softening. She needed him to imagine the ledger as something they could unpack together, as opposed to a boot stamping on someone else's throat. Redemption, if we speak of it, involves consequences, not transfers. Marco's reply was a low snarl. "You think you can teach him virtue? You'd be his novelty until he dies. Then you'll sign it all to your name and laugh while the family dies. You underestimate the way men like us survive." His eyes flicked to Johnny, hungry for confirmation. "Or you'd be killed and blamed. What old man gives away his bloodline? Something's wrong with this bargain." "Everything is wrong with your inheritance, Marco," Alessandro said on a breath that could have been a command if it had more nails. "You would have taken the house and burned the neighbors. You would do what they always fear about us. You would avenge, not save." His voice was small and affronted. "I have seen men like you. I know your hunger." There was a crack of amusement in Elena, dark and private. Hunger had been Marco's dialect since childhood. He learned it at the table and at the sparring ring. She watched him like a woman watching a chessboard being set across a cliff. To say yes now would look like capitulation to the world, an ethics lawyer folding to a man whose fingerprints were on the locks of so many ruined lives. To say no would mean the ledger remained out of reach, Marco would inherit like a vulture inheriting a ruin, and her brother might rot in a cell. She could not measure what she deserved against what justice would allow. This was not a moral equation, it was a life-saving algorithm, and she was the only coder in the room who knew how to write a backdoor. Johnny cleared his throat and, for the first time since the meal had begun, spoke without looking at either of the principals. "Don Alessandro," he said, thin-lipped and cautious, "there is paperwork to consider. If you mean to marry, there are prenuptial details, immovables, trusts, and the matter of counsel. The family will need to be informed. If this is to be used as a shield for—" He stopped. Federal eyes might be listening to his ledger nights ago. His ledger might be a radio between him and men in suits. For legal instruments, it must be properly drafted. Alessandro nodded, and, despite the tremor in his hand, he reached for the glass of water as if to steady himself. The more he rested his weight on ritual, the more Elena understood that he was bargaining with the scaffolding of institutions he had often hijacked. Marriage, trusts, wills, paper that could be weaponized for good or for theft. Her mind moved through clauses and precedents the way her fingers had once moved through code, hunting for a vulnerability she could exploit if she accepted. "Conditions," she said, and the table leaned forward like a vote. "If I say yes, it's not a surrender. I will not be a symbol. I will be a partner with boundaries. My first demand is my brother, exonerated or pardoned before the ceremony. Second, I will require independent counsel, not from your family's lawyers. Third, any signature I append in 3 months must be public and legally binding, not a ghosted transfer." She watched Alessandro's face for the small muscle that twitched when men thought of being tricked by the law they had learned to manipulate. He considered her like a case file with margins annotated in experience. Marco barked a laugh that was half fury. "You place conditions of a woman who thinks she can play a gentleman's game." He stepped so close that Elena could smell his cologne, the expensive wood and citrus of a man who bought his authority. "You will be signed into an old man's deathbed, and when Alessandro passes, I take over. The family will not be led by a woman who came with a cause." Elena's pulse steadied into a cold focus. She had choices that night. Accept and move inward like a spy. Use marriage as a legal Trojan horse to dismantle the network. Decline and watch Marco's hands rearrange power into more brutal forms? Or create a third, more dangerous option, expose everything now and trust in others' appetite for justice. She thought of her brother waking to the slotted light of prison mornings, of her mother's thin hands, of the registry of names and the secret file saved on a 6-layered drive that sat hidden in her apartment, containing more than accusations. It contained the wire transfers, the names, the buy-offs, and Marco's own signature on a board resolution she had once seen in a leaked PDF. That file was the fulcrum. "I won't be humiliated," she said finally, "nor will I be endangering a man who believes he has a right to what he thinks belongs to him." Her words were a rope for Alessandro and a blade to Marco. "If I agree, it will be on terms that protect my brother first, and public, binding terms about the signatures thereafter." A silence pooled thick as syrup in the room. Rain ticked along the windows like a metronome. Marco's posture said the war wasn't over. Alessandro's faded courage said there were battles he wanted to fight differently. Gianna's ledger rustled like a promise. Outside the doors, the servants went quiet, the building holding its breath as family history re-sculpted itself against the storm. Alessandro's smile, when it came, was small and almost sheepish. He folded his good hand over Elena's and surprised them both by pressing a kiss to the back of it like a benediction. "Yes," he said, "we make terms. We save what can be saved. We do this my way. And in 3 months, no, with time enough, I will sign the paper that names you my heir. But, Elena, I will not be forced into a confession to strangers. There are things to be handled with discretion. If you will be my wife, it will be because you want to hold this house and burn its worst rooms down yourself." Elena looked at his face and saw, beneath the regal lines and the ledger smudge, a man who was suddenly very small. She had imagined many endings for men like him, in courtrooms, in ditches, in prisons. She had not imagined being the instrument for his metamorphosis or for his final bargaining. The ledger in her bag hummed, heavy with potential. Her brother's freedom waited like an unlit fuse. Outside, the city washed itself in indifferent light. She breathed once. "I will consider," she said. Not yes, but not no. It was a compromise of sorts, a purchase of time, a girding of strategy. It would not stop the storm, but it would let her choose her moment to strike. Alessandro released her hand, and the room tipped back into its careful balance of power and menace. As they rose from the table, Marco's eyes burned with thin promise. "Don't take too long," he warned, "or the world will decide for you." Elena stepped into the corridor, and the rain welcomed her like an ally that cleansed but did not absolve. She clutched her handbag the way a woman clutches a detonator, and inside, the secret file pulsed like a living thing, an archive of debt and deceit that might free her brother or drag more bodies into the light. Tonight had given her time and placed her on a shore she had not chosen but could navigate. The bargain had been struck in words, but the real currency was always consequence, and she had a ledger only she had the key to. Elena stepped into the corridor, and the palace seemed to breathe around her, a velvet exhale, the rich scent of lemon oil and old leather. The servants' footsteps were muffled on the carpet. The storm outside had become a drumbeat. Marco's warning trailed behind her, a snake of entitlement that found its way under her skin. "Don't take too long." The words were both a threat and a timer. She closed her eyes for the length of a slow count and let the echo of the dining room settle into a plan. Her first stop was the study on the second floor, where she knew the house kept its smaller safes and the personal ledger Alessandro still allowed himself to consult. It was a room of soot-streaked maps and portraits with eyes that had learned to look away when men made bargains. She moved through it like someone inspecting a set of bones, cataloging what could be repurposed. The house smelled of ink and old leather, the ghosts of cigarettes and deals. Marco's shadow showed at the far door, taut and waiting. "You consider quickly," he said. He had that predatory smile again, that look of a man waiting for vultures to circle. 3 months is not a lifetime. If you marry him, know that you'll be marrying my enemies as well as my family. They do not forgive easily. Elena turned to face him. The corridor's light made the planes of his face look sculpted and cruel. "And if I don't?" she asked. "What would you do, Marco? What will you do to my brother, to anyone who stands between you and what you want?" He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "What I always do. Remove threats. Consolidate." His hand brushed a bronzed rail like a casual caress. "You think you're clever because you hold a file. Men like you forget that a file can be deleted. I can unmake your work with a few phone calls and a well-placed crash. I know how the ledger looks to you," she said. "Public, easy to target. But the ledger is more than paper. People like you forget about shadows that do not show until you look for them." She did not elaborate. She could not yet. The file she kept had more than names. It had backups and redundancies, and it had relationship maps that would make markets cringe.
It had, most importantly, a timed release she could trigger remotely if the consequences demanded it. That knowledge gave her a currency beyond Alessandro's titles, the power of disclosure. Marco studied her for a beat that stretched into strategy. If you are truly a lawyer, you'll know how quickly evidence collapses under pressure. Courts are slow, and my people are fast. His voice sizzled with certainty. You need me to believe you'll play fair, Elena. If you play both sides, you'll die a slow death that my uncle will sign with a flourish. She smiled then, small and predatory. Then your task is clear. Make me believe you can keep your men in check. They spoke in chess moves, threats masked as negotiations, light as a blade. When Marco left, the house sighed and resumed its watch. Elena wandered into a small balcony that overlooked the stone courtyard. Rain ran like memory over the tiles. She pulled out her phone in the shelter of shadow and dialed a number she had not used in months. "Isabella?" she whispered when the voice answered, tight, weary, always practical. Isabella was the one friend who had not been bought or frightened away by threats. She was the one who had also worked nights in a whistleblower hotline, and who had a very particular set of connections. "It's Elena." Elena. A pause, and then, "Oh, God." "How did it go?" "We're negotiating," she said simply. Negotiating was the sugar word she used to keep the edge of panic from her voice. "Don't move, Izzy. I need you to start a chain. If I accept, I will need you to place a silent hold on 3 accounts, flag 8 entities for the European Court, and prep an immunity dossier for my brother. If this looks like a trap, I'm going to pull the file." Isabella was silent a fraction of a second too long. "You'd go public?" "If I have to. But I won't be reckless." Elena's mouth tasted of iron. "Start the chain. If anything happens to me between now and when the papers are signed, those files go to 3 independent journalists and 1 prosecutor in Rome. You know the protocol." "Elena," Isabella said, voice smaller now, "you know once they see this, they will come with everything. Marco won't hesitate. This is a storm." "Then make the storm more expensive," Elena said. The words surprised her with their steadiness. "Make sure those accounts freeze on signature. Make sure there are decoys so that Marco's first purges look successful but leave his core exposed. Disinformation. Delay. Prepare a whistleblower package with time-stamped encryption. And Izzy, get my brother's file clean, quietly." "I'll start now," Isabella promised. The phone clicked off. Elena closed her eyes and let the map of tasks unfurl. Isabella would start a logistical web. She would contact a single, trusted federal contact whose face she knew only from a poker table of conversations years ago, an accountant who had once sent her an anonymous tip about a back door. And she would prepare the small legal trap she could lay beneath the ceremonial veneer of marriage. A public declaration of certain terms, a notarized trust with a third-party executor chosen by Elena, and a condition that any attempt to hide assets would automatically trigger her prearranged release. It would be tight. It would be fragile. It would also be the only thing that might keep Marco from simply taking everything when Alessandro's breath left him. Back in the study, Alessandro sat in a high-backed chair, the evening's adrenaline retreating and leaving exhaustion behind. He watched her approach like a man watching a sea he had once learned to read. "Have you decided?" he asked without the performative gravel. There was a tenderness there that did not fit his public portrait, like an old photograph that had been defaced with ink. You could still see the child beneath the scrawl. "I haven't decided," she said, "but I have conditions." She repeated the demands she had outlined at the table, this time specifying more granularly. A signed pardon mechanism vetted by an independent counsel. An irrevocable trust naming her as beneficiary only under terms that explicitly punished any attempt to embezzle funds in the interim. a public affidavit that would make certain transfers impossible to hide in the immediate wake of his death. Each clause was a lock designed to slow Marco's hand. Alessandro listened, folding the requests against his limited time like laundry. "You are practical," he murmured. There was a hint of admiration in the tone that made her stomach shift. It was not the admiration of a man praising cleverness. It was the awe of someone who recognized skill he could not claim for himself. She could see the rationed humanity behind his eyes now, the kind that had once opened vaults and closed businesses with the same humming calm. "You could walk away," she said, half to herself. "You could let the law take you. You're not invincible." "No," he agreed. "But what happens then? They will take me in pieces. The boys will fight, and the world will bleed. I don't want my name to be the instrument of more ruin. I'd rather give the house to someone who will know where to light a match and where to put the water." "Or someone who will torch everything for the headlights," she countered. It was not accusation, but caution. She had spent too many nights in courtrooms watching every mercy calcify into another ledger entry. Alessandro held her gaze. "You will make me better," he said with a frankness that startled her. "Not because you can change the history behind me, but because you will make me face it. You will make me decide who I am at the end. I am tired, Elena. I am afraid of what legacy I will leave if I leave nothing but greed." There was a moment when the world narrowed to the two of them and the sound of rain. Elena thought of her brother's lean face and her mother's acceptance of small meals. She thought of all the settlements that had taught her that justice could be purchased, but also that truth, once set loose, had a habit of unmaking empires. "Do you love me?" she asked suddenly, not because she needed to know the answer, but because the question defined the mileage between pity and partnership. If he loved her, it would complicate everything. If he did not, there was still the raw calculus of power and protection. Alessandro's fingers tightened on the armrest. "I have loved many things," he said slowly. "Power, strategies, my family in ways that were not kind. I have not loved you, not in the gentle sense. But I love my certainty less than I used to. Perhaps that is a kind of love, an affection for someone who forces me to be honest." She exhaled, the sound pulling her chest open. It was not romantic, but it was honest. "Then we make a contract, not a fairy tale." Her legal heart found solace in the word contract. It was a structure, a map. We write terms. And we give my brother a way out before the vows. He nodded, and the small relief that passed through his face was almost childlike. "We will call Johnny and the other men. We will draft. We will set witnesses. We will not be fools." "Nor is Marco," Elena's tone sharpened. "He will act. He will not wait politely for documents. He will try to force the change by breaking things that cannot be easily healed." Alessandro inhaled a breath that was more like resolve than oxygen. "Then we set traps of our own." They spent the rest of the night like two generals planning a siege of their own family. Elena outlined the legal scaffolding: independent counsel, notarized vows, immediate amnesty for her brother, while Alessandro arranged for men who were still loyal to him to place harmless but telling obstructions in Marco's path. Coded instructions in the servers to delay, men stationed at certain corporate offices to intercept any physical attempts to seize papers, and the careful use of the house's own security to keep certain rooms under watch. Each action was a splintering of the Moretti machine, a reconfiguration of loyalty through the delicate art of favors and threats. When dawn bled into the windows, neither of them slept. They had become, for a few hours, co-conspirators. The air between them had narrowed to a compact of necessity. Elena had bought herself time, chains of law that might hold against brute force, and Alessandro had bought, perhaps, the possibility of being looked at by history with something like mercy. Outside, the city exhaled a day that would not know yet how close it had come to becoming a battlefield. Inside, Elena felt the ledger in her bag like a heart that beat faster the closer she walked to the door. She had made an arrangement with a dying titan, but arrangements were engines of change when built by people who understood both law and code. They were not love yet, not trust, but a shared labor of preservation and retribution. When Marco came to the study at dawn, arrogant and unbroken, he found the house quiet and the servants more brisk. His face was a map of impatience. "We will set a date," Alessandro told him simply, with the power of an old man who had decided to use his last currency not on fear, but on a slow, intelligent paralysis. "You will be named in the will as a trustee, if you behave." Marco's laugh was a knife. "You hand your house to a stranger and call it redemption. You will die and leave me ashes, Don." He spat the words as if taste mattered. "Then prove to me that you are not a vulture," Alessandro said. "Prove that when I am gone, the house stands, not as a pile of bones, but as something that might hold a child's hand. If you betray that, there will be witnesses and a public record. You will have no plausible deniability." Marco's eyes darted between Elena and Alessandro like a predator scoping prey. And for a moment, Elena saw panic under the mask. Fear was a new component in his calculus. She had given him something he could not easily swallow: the possibility that the law could be weaponized against his entitlement. "Set your date," he said, too fast. "Set your conditions. But know this. If I find you have lied, Elena Rossi, I will take everything you love and make it mine." Elena folded her hands and watched him. "Threats noted," she said. "Promises recorded." He left with a slam of the door that shifted dust in the air like warning bells. The house sank again into the muted rhythm of the morning. Elena felt the weight of the day like an aftershock. She had made a choice to sit at the table where empires were re-signed, and now she would have to live by its consequences. The ledger hummed in her bag as she walked back to the study. The file's shadow reached toward the future like a promise she might keep, or a weapon she might have to use. For the first time in 5 years, Elena felt that she stood not on the outside of the machine, but inside its gears. The machine could grind her bones or preserve her brother's breath. The choice between those two outcomes would require every skill she had earned as lawyer and hacker, and something she had not yet named: a moral geometry that would decide whether power could become a tool of repair rather than only of destruction. The act of entering the house had been a pivot. Now the real work began. The act of entering the house had been a pivot. Now the machine inside its walls groaned and reoriented itself around new teeth. Elena had bought air and time and assigned names to the locks she intended to place on the Moretti engine. But the house and its people were not inert things. They moved, thought, feared, resented. The first fracture came from where she had least wanted it, from trust dressed as loyalty. At noon, the servers in Alessandro's study, old racks softened by restorations, the kind of equipment an old man uses to pretend he keeps up, billeted a soft, sour alarm. Johnny, who had been careful as a shadow, called for Elena with a voice that trembled like a ledger page at the edge of fire. "There's been a purge," he said, breath sharp with numbers. "Someone's pushing an overwrite on the archival sequences. It looks like Marco moved first." Elena's hands went cold the way hands go when they're about to sprint. She grabbed her bag with the file like a talisman and ran for the study.
The server room smelled warm and metallic, men with the family's colors at their wrists clustered by screens. Lines of code scrolled like tiny knives. Marco had launched a sweep intended to trash the house's backups, to erase the traces that might bind him to graft or murder. In one coordinated strike, he wanted to make the ledger a pile of ash. "Who authorized it?" Elena demanded. Johnny looked at her, and for a half-beat she thought he would lie. Instead, he looked like a man struck between two wills. "I didn't authorize it," he said, "but a command came through a user token with your—" He stopped as if a word had choked him. "Your name's on it." The sound of betrayal opened in her chest like a wound. Her hands moved of their own accord, faster than thought, running diagnostic loops she'd written when she still lived in a basement wired to alarms. She hit counters, set throttles, spun up a quarantine note she had prepared as an insurance policy. Isabella's chain had not yet been fully placed, the accounts were still soft, and Marco had timed this like a predator cutting the rope before it tightened. If he erased the backups, the prosecution and the journalists would have nothing to hold him with. Her brother would remain a silent cell of humiliation. "Who has access to Gianni's token?" she asked. The men around her looked at one another. Loyalty in the Moretti house was not a conversation, it was a currency traded in instinct. Now the currency had been counterfeited. "It came through the accountant line," one tech said, "smuggled through a footnote in a payroll script. He didn't see it, he signed it with a hand that—" The voice, thin and reverent, broke. "Someone has been copying signatures." Elena felt the ground shift. Marco's purge was not merely a fast hand, it was surgical. He had prepared to cut even as they negotiated. He had planned a decapitation disguised as housekeeping. She activated her contingency. A cascade of encrypted breadcrumbs she had laid in the ledger's metadata, old habits of a hacker who had never truly retired, began to unfurl. Files mirrored themselves into dead-drop servers in jurisdictions so small they were nearly myth. The purge hit the mirrors and stalled, slowed by the redundancy she had built in a moment of prudence. But redundancy was not impenetrability. Marco had means, people he could bribe, servers he could buy, and time was the currency he spent with relish. While the techs worked, Gianni sank into the nearest chair and covered his face with his hands. His betrayal, or the appearance of it, hung in the air like cut glass. Elena wanted to shake him, to make him name the other men whose hands had touched the ledger. Instead, she crouched in front of him and kept her voice low. "Tell me everything you know," she said. "No script, no euphemism. Who else had keys to that token? And when did you last see Marco in front of the main console?" Gianna's shoulders convulsed. "He was there last night," he said. "He claimed he needed to update inventory. He said Don Alessandro asked him to tidy the files. His words scraped as if they had been dragged across gravel. "I signed because I thought it was routine." Elena had the practical sense to be furious and the strategic sense to be mercilessly calm. Marco would stage routine things to look like chores. He would use the weight of accustomed movements to cover violence. She filed the anger away like a report to be filed for later use. Outside the study, another blow landed. A phone call that made her stomach fall the way it does when your breath is stolen. It was her brother's lawyer, the voice on the line tight with alarm. "They're moving his cell," he said. "He was taken to interrogation. They say new evidence was found." Elena's throat closed. The Moretti internecine war had become a hammer over her brother's head. Enacting her plan now, dragging the ledger into public, would trigger reprisals. Waiting and trying to fortify the scaffolding of law risked the deletion of evidence. Her edge was sharpened between impossible choices: expose and risk immediate violent reprisal, stall and risk erasure. She felt Alessandro's presence behind her like gravity.
He had been in the server room for the last hour. He watched circuits light up with the same fascination he once felt for markets. "Do you want me to stop them?" he asked, and the question was not rhetorical. For the first time, the Moretti machine might obey the man, not because he ordered it, but because he had agreed to see it used differently. "What will you do?" she asked. He had men loyal to him who could physically prevent the moves Marco wanted, but those men were scattered and cautious. Old favors had brittle edges. "I will call the ones who still listen to my whispers," he said. "I will tell them there will be consequences if they touch the sealed rooms. I will make it costly. And I will go to Marco and tell him that any further moves will be treated publicly as theft, with me as the complainant." He sounded like a man making a last gamble. Elena wanted to believe him, desperately. She had seen too many kings die with their armies gnashing like wolves over the carcass. At that moment, the door to the server room slammed open, and Marco walked in as if no war had begun. He wore a suit that fit like a promise and a face that was all ruthless intention. "Johnny," he said, voice soft, "why are we slowing down? The purge hasn't finished." Alessandro folded himself into a posture that was equal parts frailty and command. "Because I said stop," he said. "Because there will be no more purges against the house while I live." Marco's smile was sharp. "You would die before you let your nephews govern? You would bequeath your name to a stranger while your blood waits to inherit?" The accusation was perfumed with disgust. "You have been soft, uncle." "Perhaps I am," Alessandro admitted. The honesty in his voice was a blade. "Perhaps that's the point." Marco stepped closer until he was within reach. "You will not embarrass the family," he said. "You will not hand the empire to a woman who opposes us." Elena felt the cold of his threat like a physical thing. She stepped between them, less to defend Alessandro than to keep herself from being boxed into a corner. "If this is an attempt to intimidate," she said, voice steady, "then you should know that I have redundancies in place. Isolate me or strike, and some of this goes public in ways that will not die with papers." Marco's eyes flicked to her bag, where the ledger rested like a sleeping animal. There was a small, dangerous gleam in his gaze. "You threaten me with ghosts and journalists?" he said. "You forget that ghosts can be silenced and journalists bought." "Then do it," she said. Her answer was a knife. "You'll find it expensive." The standoff hung like a taut wire. Then Johnny, who had been the hinge of the morning's chaos, rose and spoke in a voice that was not entirely his. "I signed it," he said, "but the token came from a forwarded authorization. It had your ID, Elena, but the certificate was spoofed. Whoever did it made it look like you. I didn't realize until the purge started pulling backups and they named your file." The revelation was a shard. Marco's jaw thinned, a silent admission of talent recognized. "So, you admit you were fooled?" "I admit I was careless," Johnny replied. "I didn't check the chain. I trusted the pattern. For that, I am sorry." Elena wanted to throttle him and thank him in the same breath. The spoofing proved a sophistication she respected and feared. Marco had the technical reach to forge signatures, to copy handprints of trust. If he could fake her token, he could fake her intent. Her file could be used as a scapegoat, a convenient villain for a purge he orchestrated. "Who else?" she asked. Johnny swallowed. "There's another ledger, an off-site one, not in the house's servers. Marco set up a node months ago in a company he controls. He keeps shadow copies there." Elena's breath hitched. Even as she had planned redundancies, she had not imagined a shadow copy within Marco's own domain. The realization re-knit her stomach into a knot. Marco had been preparing for civil war for years. He had planned contingencies that included stealing the very safety she thought she could create. "Who else?" she asked. Johnny swallowed. "There's another ledger, an off-site one, not in the house's servers. Marco set up a node months ago in a company he controls. He keeps shadow copies there." Elena's breath hitched. Even as she had planned redundancies, she had not imagined a shadow copy within Marco's own domain. The realization re-knit her stomach into a knot. Marco had been preparing for civil war for years. He had planned contingencies that included stealing the very safety she thought she could create. There were a dozen ways for this news to break. An armed raid on the off-site node, a stealth takeover, or a visible, violent act that would turn law enforcement into spectators rather than actors. Each had costs. Each might end with someone she loved behind bars, or worse. Alessandro leaned in, voice suddenly small and raw. "Bring me the location," he said. "I will send men." She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe the old man could still order men to protect the fragile scaffolding she had put in place, but she also had learned to read the look on his face when he chose which favors to spend. The ledger of debts he carried was as long as his name. Every man he called in owed him something. Each favor demanded a price. Sometimes the price was a favor due when he was gone, an inheritance in emotional debt. "This is war," Elena said. It was not a complaint, but a fact that settled in the bones. "We fight it with law and with deception. We do not give Marco the satisfaction of clean victory." Marco laughed, a crisp, metallic sound. "You would weaponize the law," he said. "You would hide behind it to stop me. How very bourgeois." "This isn't about bourgeois or blood," Elena said. "It's about whether you will let a man rot in a cell because he once tried to feed his family." For a second, something like shame crossed Marco's face, but the shadow passed too fast to be honest. "He was a hacker for hire," he said. "He took what he was paid. He chose." "And who employed him?" Elena asked. "Who left the ledger open?" Marco's expression flickered. The interrogation was a tight seam. His eyes darted like someone with something to hide. "You have no proof," he said. "I don't need proof yet," Elena replied. "I need to stop you from destroying it. Give me the address of that node, and I will sign a document with your name guaranteeing immunity for the men who hand it over. Public, not a smokescreen." Marco studied her, and then, to her surprise, gave a small, resigned nod. "You ask much," he said. "And you," Alessandro said quietly, "asked to be made human at the end of your life. This is how we test that." A minute later, Marco spat a location in a cadence like a dare. Elena took it and felt the bones in her wrists clench, as if ready to set a trap. Gianni moved with new purpose, breathing a little easier to step from paralysis into action. Men who still had names responded to old currency. Alessandro made calls that sounded like concessions. The house, for now, stitched its seams. Yet, in the quiet after the exchange, there was a new silence between Elena and Alessandro. A fragile gap where intimacy had almost begun, and trust now had a hairline fracture. He had promised protection with men who owed him favors. She had promised restraints with legal structures. Marco had conceded to a route that contained public witnesses. But none of it had assured the one thing that mattered most: whether the ledger would leave the house whole and intact. As Elena walked back to the balcony, the ledger in her bag felt heavier than before, as if knowledge bore weight the same way guilt did. Trust in the Moretti family had been refashioned overnight like a weapon. She had allies she hadn't anticipated, and betrayals she had not fully accounted for. A promise had been made. A new front had opened. The fractures in alliances had shown their faces and stepped into the light. At dusk, when she finally allowed herself a single private breath, she understood what the morning had done. It had revealed the architecture of the enemy and the betrayals inside its walls. It had also shown her that to save her brother, she might have to watch more things burn than she had imagined. The choice ahead was no longer simply strategic. It had become moral in an intimate and unbearable way, one that would require a fracture of her own making, a break. She sat on the balcony and let the rain find her again, steady and indifferent. Below, the Moretti house hummed like a beast that had been pricked. Inside, men made moves that neither law nor conscience could fully predict. Elena's file pulsed in her bag. The instruments of disclosure and the tools of deception lay before her like two thin knives. One of them would have to be used. The other would likely cut her, as well. The rain stitched the courtyard into a silver sheet, and Elena let it drum her resolve. The ledger in her bag was not simply ink and timestamp, it was a heart pump for a machine that could be rerouted. She moved like someone who had planned for disaster and found one more contingency. "Bring me 4 men who still trust my name," Alessandro said when she returned to the study, voice thin but steady. Not boys, men who took an oath before loyalties hardened into debt. She watched him choose the words as if they were currency. "I'll need someone to lead a discreet operation to the node," she replied. "Not violence, intelligence. We bring witnesses, we retrieve the shadow copy, and we present it in a court that cannot be bought by a handshake." He nodded. "I'll call Fabrizio. He owes me a favor he never paid for. He'll move quiet." Marco's grudging consent to hand over the node had been a trap wrapped in bravado. He had not expected them to organize with tenderness. Elena and Alessandro moved through the house like conspirators molding a single plan, his muscle, her law. They agreed on precise parameters: no blood unless forced, public witnesses only at the moment of reveal, legal counsel present, and a chain of custody signed and notarized the instant the off-site server came into their hands. Dusk stitched itself into action. Fabrizio arrived, an old lieutenant with creased skin and a conscience paid for in long silence. He brought 3 men who remembered young Alessandro as a different kind of leader, one who once kept promises because promises were currency. They moved like ghosts through service corridors and under the city's rain to the industrial warehouse Marco had boasted as impenetrable. The node was a neat metal box, a bank of drives humming with shadow copies. Elena crouched beside it with gloved hands, heart calibrated to the click of hard drives. Her world narrowed to syntax and signatures. Fabrizio's men watched corridors, while Alessandro stood at the edge of the door like a man observing the end of his life with a brittle pride. They opened the server and found redundancy intact. Marco had anticipated mirrors, but not the legal chain they had prepared. Notarized warrants, a prosecutor on standby, a camera surgically trained to stream a watermark of custody across secure channels. Elena felt something like vindication as the drive image began to duplicate, a perfect, immutable copy moving into the custody of a neutral authority. In the warehouse's low light, Marco's men arrived, too late for secrecy, too early for fury. A scuffle flared when one of them reached for a drive. Fabrizio moved first, a flat palm across a face, the vibration of old loyalties shattering a modern assault. Alessandro stepped forward, voice low and steady, and said a name that sounded like an order. It was not just his authority, it was a history of debts repaid and debts called in. "Stop," he said. "We will not spill blood for pride tonight." A muscle in Marco's jaw worked. He could have detonated the warehouse, called in reinforcements, or killed midnight witnesses. Instead, he held. Men who had learned to follow a younger, hungrier version of him watched the more ancient chain of command buckle their wills. For a suspended breath, the Moretti house and its heirs learned the cost of restraint. They loaded the drives into a sealed case. A prosecutor arrived as planned, his badge like a light in the dark, and Elena watched the chain of custody seal around the data that could unmake half of Marco's empire. Her brother's name flashed in the file as an annotation, a small beacon of possible freedom. Back at the palazzo, a reporter they had fed a breadcrumb arrived with a tape rolling. Lawyers read affidavits in the hall. Cameras caught Alessandro signing a public declaration that named Elena as a beneficiary under specific, constrained terms and made any surreptitious transfer a criminal act witnessed in real time. The engine of the family stalled. Marco raged, promising reprisals, but the law had already taken its first tangible hold. Elena felt the pricing of her gamble. Every man she had persuaded to act risked a past favor. Every notarized witness owed a terrible repayment. She had used them anyway. That night, in the study, Alessandro looked smaller and braver. He had given commands, asked debts to be paid, and watched men move. He had risked his remaining currency for something like repair. "You put them in jeopardy," he said softly, not accusatory, but honest. "I put them on the right side of what comes next," Elena answered. "Sometimes that costs something now to save others later." He reached for her hand and, with a tremor, pressed it to his lips. "If this costs me everything," he whispered, "I have no regret that you stood here with me." She felt an ache because she knew the truth of his confession. His love was not the tender romance of novels, but a raw, filial devotion to having his name mean less harm. She met his eyes, and, for the first time, the thought of being his wife tasted less like a bargain and more like a responsibility she could hold, if he lived long enough to sign the papers properly. "We score a victory," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "But the fight isn't over. Marco will retaliate." "Then we prepare," Alessandro said, and his gaze slid toward the ledger in her bag. "Do what you must to keep him alive. My men will stand where they will stand. You tell me when to order them." Elena saw the sacrifice waiting inside the choice she had made, to bind herself to a man whose past demanded atonement, to risk the lives of those who trusted his name, and to accept being used as a shield. It was a cruel calculus, but in the warehouse's warm light and the prosecutor's sealed case, a pathway had opened, a chance to free her brother and remake a broken house. "I will," she said, "if you ask me to." He did not ask for love, he asked for courage. She had bargained for time and then spent it on this, a raid that gathered proof, witnesses, and a public record. In the small hours, as men filed reports and cameras cooled, Elena and Alessandro sat side by side, hands joined like an unsteady treaty. Marcos's empire had been cut with one neat legal incision that night. It would sting him and force ugly replies, but the drives were in custody and her brother's file now had witnesses to its provenance. The victory was jagged and incomplete, but it was real. Alessandro turned his face toward her, older and suddenly transparent. "If this begets hatred," he murmured, "let it be hatred at me." She squeezed his hand. "Then we will own it together." Outside, the storm broke into applause and city lights blinked awake. Inside, two unlikely conspirators held a fragile peace, redemptive, dangerous, and threaded with sacrifice. They came for Marco before dawn. It was not a cinematic siege, but a quiet, legally suffused unmaking. Prosecutors with sealed indictments, Fabrizio's men holding perimeters, and armored vans that smelled of bureaucracy and finality. Marcos's arrest was less a roar than a collapse, handcuffs closing on a wrist that had expected to always command. He shouted, he promised retribution. He spat threats that sounded small in the corridor of witnesses. The drives Elena had secured were the slow, cold engine of the case.
The notarized chain of custody, the prosecutor's witness, Isabella's encrypted timeline, and Johnny's stunned confession made a lattice the law could climb. Marco's empire crumpled into evidence. Her brother came home with keys and a bleached, astonished grin. The prosecutor had moved faster than she had thought possible, presenting the shadow copy and the notarized affidavit in a hearing that turned the judge's gavel into something like a bell of deliverance. The charges against him, fabricated traces, planted logs, a coerced confession, were vacated with a kind of bureaucratic mercy that felt miraculous because it had been painstakingly engineered. He stepped from the courthouse like a man reborn, and Elena watched him with the reckless, private relief that comes when a long siege finally yields a doorway. Alessandro kept his promise in the only way he could: public, irrevocable, painfully honest. In a small courtroom that smelled of dust and paper, he signed the instruments Elena had demanded. He named independent trustees, agreed to transparent audits, and activated a trust whose custodian was a panel of human rights lawyers and international prosecutors. The Moretti holdings were not gifted to Elena as private spoils, but redirected into reparative structures, compensations, community funds, and legal clinics for the families his networks had hollowed. It was less a legacy of power than one of restitution. He insisted a clause be added that required the house to fund programs in places his operations had once crushed. His signature trembled but did not falter. When he returned to the palazzo that evening, the man who had once brokered assassinations seemed smaller and steadier. He did not ask for love. He asked for the grace to die honest to a new shape of himself. Elena sat with him in a small sitting room while rain inked the windows, and they spoke of things that felt like truth, of atonement, of what it meant to hand one's name over to correction. Weeks later, Marco faced trial and conviction on charges both corporate and criminal. The Moretti network fractured, deals unraveled. Men who had once answered only to ledger now answered to subpoenas. Fabrizio's men remained loyal to a code reshaped by the old Don's final orders. Johnny entered witness protection, and then, awkwardly, forgiveness. Elena did not become the Don. She became something harder to define: a steward of broken things, a litigator who rebuilt rather than raised, a woman who navigated love and law with the same precise hand. She never wore Alessandro's ring in the way tabloids predicted. She accepted his partnership as contract and covenant, paper that had teeth and a human warmth stitched into its margins. When Alessandro's illness finally took him, it was quiet, and he was surrounded by people who had chosen to be present because of promises kept rather than fear. At the funeral, in the rain that had become their constant chorus, Elena folded the final ledger into a file bound for court, then set it aside. She walked alone afterward to the edge of the city where stone met the restless sea. The wind tasted of salt and new reckoning. She took a small pebble from the shoreline and, with fingers that had once typed code and argued in courtrooms, she placed it on the water's edge, watching waves erase the trace, like a program running to completion. She had entered the house to bargain for one life. She left it having rewritten many. The Moretti name, once a brand of fear, would now carry the faint whir of restitution and the brittle, hopeful sound of legal instruments learning to do better. Elena folded her coat tighter and let the wind take her hair. In the wake of power and violence, she had made a new normal: messy, costly, real. The last thing she heard, over gulls and a city waking, was rain tapping the stones. A small, steady sound that felt like a benediction.